Welcome everyone, Christine here with the discussion about my recommended campaigns for new players in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires, because Creative Assembly made a list of campaigns that they recommend players choose from when they're starting as a fresh player, and they chose Karl Franz from the Empire, Miao Ying from Grand Cafe, and Tyrion for the High Elves. Now, when I first saw this list, and this has been the case since Immortal Empires came out, but when I first saw this list, I had to laugh at the notion of Karl Franz being a recommended first campaign. As someone put it in the comment section recently, it's Netflix comedy gold that they recommend this campaign for new players to start out with. It's not necessarily too horrible if you're playing obviously on, let's say, normal. Sure, it's not too terrible, but it's still a really bad campaign to throw a new player in because of the mechanics in the Empire, how broken those mechanics are, the Imperial Authority, the issues that it creates, the issues that get created in trying to hold an empire together, or else you're going to face a civil war, and significant downsides if you let your Imperial Authority slide too low. Many problems. Certainly not a recommended campaign for new players. In fact, even for the Empire, like if you're starting to play the Empire for the very first time just to get the feel for their mechanics and how they play, Gelt is a much better choice. Hell, Volkmar and Marcus Wolfhard, for all the issues that they have on lower difficulties, are much better choices than Karl Franz given his campaign situation. But certainly the Empire is not a recommended race for new players, for beginners, and Karl Franz is actually the worst Imperial Legendary Lord to recommend for new players. Okay, what about Miao Ying? Cafe is pretty decent. Miao Ying's campaign does have certainly quite a few benefits to it, but throwing a new player to deal in with the harmony system that Cafe has and the many issues it will cause in your campaigns, even if you're a veteran player, is not what I'd recommend. Now, don't get me wrong, you can certainly deal with the harmony system and make Cafe work very well. They are a good race, they're a strong race. They're the only race from Warhammer 3, with the exception of like the Warriors of Chaos rework, that actually work very well at the moment. But they do have problems. The limitations of terrain types, the limitations of the yin yang system, the harmony system, just not great on the campaign map in particular. Certainly can work, but not something I'd throw a new player against. The only campaign I'd recommend out of the list Creative Assembly has put together is Tyrion for the High Elves. This is interesting because Tyrion came out at the launch of Warhammer 2. He has always been a recommended campaign ever since he was introduced, and that has always stayed true. But I'll get into his campaign a bit later in the video, but certainly the only recommended campaign I'd actually give people, though there are certainly going to be some limitations if you don't own the High Elven DLC. Now, making a list like this is a bit more complicated than you might think. You have to account for difficulty levels, which I try not to do in these videos. Like when it comes to these videos, I just talk about situations that you're encountering on Legendary very hard, because obviously things are much easier to deal with on normal. But let's say someone's inexperienced, someone doesn't know how to play. What would you tell them to do? Well, the first campaign you should actually play when you pick up Warhammer 3 is The Lost God. It's a tutorial campaign. It's specifically designed as a tutorial campaign. Yes, it's very hand-holdy. Yes, it can feel frustrating if you have any degree of competency in strategy games. But if you're a completely fresh player, I would strongly recommend this campaign because it does introduce quite a lot of mechanics. Not necessarily in the way that those mechanics play out in Immortal Empires. I think they could have done a better job at handling that, the transition between this campaign and Realms of Chaos, let alone Immortal Empires. But still, they did put in quite a lot of effort to create a tutorial campaign. So you're going to be dealing with recruitment, building settlements, battles, different battle tactics, different types of enemies, all that kind of stuff. So if you're picking up Warhammer 3 right now, don't just jump in Immortal Empires. Go through The Lost God and then go for Immortal Empires. Realms of Chaos is not a good learning tool for a new player to learn the game at the moment. It never has been. That's kind of the problem. Like, if you're thinking, oh, I'll just play this one, then this one, then this one. No, this one is really, really bad at the moment, given its design. Maybe different with the Chaos Dwarves, that's a different discussion, but yeah, play the Lost God campaign. Now, let's talk a bit about difficulty levels. What difficulty levels should you play on? And it's not necessarily so cut and dry when it comes to difficulty levels. Like, you could play a campaign, certain campaigns on legendary easy and just steamroll everything, even if you don't necessarily know what you're doing. But when it comes to proper difficulty levels, I'd probably say if you have any knowledge of strategy games, you could go to hard, maybe set the battle difficulty to easy. This is not necessarily because of the way battles are going to be affected by this, but because of how the auto-resolve is going to be affected in game. Basically, the auto-resolve is very punishing on any difficulty except easy, and even on easy, it can feel very punishing for a lot of races. So you'll have a better time if you set this to easy. If you're just starting as a player, even if you're setting things all the way to legendary, it's going to be a much better experience. But of course, normal or hard, and battle difficulty to easy. Not because of the battles. You can always switch the battle difficulty before a battle if you want a harder challenge, if you want a proper challenge. But when it comes to how battle difficulty impacts the auto-resolve, easy can be a good choice. However, there is a downside. If you set it to easy, it makes the AI very, very passive on the campaign map. They won't take settlements, they won't take provincial capitals in particular, they won't deal with sieges. So it makes the AI very, very passive compared to how it is to any other difficulty. So maybe the best solution is normal. But that is a bit of a tricky discussion because I think it really depends on the campaign and on the race. Because setting it to easy can lead to some much better campaigns if, you know, you're a fresh player, you're learning the game. But setting it to a higher difficulty can really lead to some better campaigns for certain very powerful races. So it's a bit of a tricky question to answer. Normal, of course, is probably how the majority of the player base plays on. I'm actually curious about that. I probably should do a poll and ask people what kind of difficulty they're playing on. But I do imagine a lot of people are probably playing at least normal battle difficulty, maybe some higher campaign difficulty. If you're looking to increase the challenge, don't necessarily what increasing the battle difficulty will do many times. It's not necessarily increase the challenge; it's increase the level of frustration. Campaign difficulty will actually increase the challenge in a lot of ways, though. Setting battle difficulty to very hard will absolutely increase the challenge on the campaign map because because legendary comparing to very hard makes the AI very aggressive in terms of conquering settlements. Just a bit of a discussion there on difficulty levels and the kind of impact they have. It's not just what you see here, it's also how the AI plays on the campaign map because these difficulties affect how the AI perceives its threat level, its opponents, and how willing they are to be aggressive against you and against other factions. Also, higher campaign difficulties do affect, in particular, how aggressive they are against you in particular. There is an AI bias on higher difficulties, especially. At number 5, we have Morathi of the Dark Elves. Now, Dark Elves aren't a very popular race at this very moment because of changes that Creative Assembly made from Warhammer 2 into Warhammer 3, but I think they're a pretty good race, especially in the early game. And the vast majority of any challenge that you can have in a campaign does come from the early game situation. You want to know why Wood Elves, Warriors of Chaos, and other races are really dominant? It's because they have a really strong early game. So do the Dark Elves. Now, they do have some issues in the long term, but Morathi actually does go a long way towards helping you dealing with some of those issues because she has Slaneshi Corruption that gives you extra control. So you're never going to face rebellion with her due to the slaves that you're dealing with. But either way, now this campaign can be pretty straightforward. There's also, of course, pitfalls when you're dealing with this campaign. So you only have one army over here to deal with because the faction you start a war with doesn't have any other army, it doesn't have any other lord, so it's going to take them some turns to do so, to build some units. And the units they're going to recruit are certainly not going to be able to stand up to your army. You can easily sweep these guys aside. Turn 1, take the Petrified Forest. Turn 2, take Great Rock Point. Recruit another lord, get some Dark Shards recruited over there. Turn 3, take the settlement, and then move into Iron Spike. Now, what's great about this campaign is it's pretty straightforward. The campaign, look at the design of it. They have Iron Spike here, so if you're a new player, you might wonder, well, okay, so I took that, what do I do next? Well, it's pretty straightforward what you're supposed to do in this campaign. It's actually the best decision. Take Iron Spike. Then, of course, you find yourself in the Ashen Coast, which is controlled largely by Skaven. Wipe them out. They stand no chance against you. Though then you're going to have to deal with the unpleasant climate over here in the mountains. but you are certainly recommended to keep going here. And also loot or sack these elements dependent on how many campaign movement points you have left. Like if you have enough campaign movement points to sack a element and then occupy it in the same turn, do so. You need about, what, 30% campaign movement points to be able to do so. Maybe, depends on the terrain, really, but I'd say 30% is probably a good metric. Maybe a bit less than that, maybe in some cases a bit more than that, depends on the terrain. But sack a settlement and then occupy it, or just loot and occupy it, though it does carry a bigger public order penalty. By the way, just move from settlement to settlement, conquering along the way. But then you also have the situation over here in the south that can be a diplomatic quagmire. Your best decision is, of course, to make a deal with Mazdamundi. Now, on lower difficulties, Mazdamundi is likely not going to declare war on you for a fairly long time, especially if you don't piss him off. The AI is fairly passive on lower difficulties, so you certainly have a pretty decent safety net if you decide not to piss off these factions. Is conquer this territory, sell it to Mazdamundi, you end up about here, and then look, you have all of this territory that's available, and by the time you get here, you should have recruited enough units. In fact, you can recruit a full army for Morathi to start her conquest path here very quickly. You end up around here, and then you have a bunch of choices. Do you continue going north for your campaign victory conditions, which, yeah, that is the intention, because you're supposed to deal with this faction over here, Harganef, or do you decide to invade Ulfwan? If you're an experienced player, if you're willing to take some risks, you can do both. The Dark Elves are great, also as a good choice, because they have a lot of hero capacity, which can be pretty annoying as a new player when you're starting out. It certainly was annoyed when I started Warhammer 1 and realized how hard it could be to unlock certain heroes. But you do have the ability to increase your hero capacity pretty quickly. Masters at tier 2, Sorceresses tier 3, K-Knight Assassins can be tier 4, but that's really only for Morathi. In general, they're tier 3, and Death Hags, of course, at tier 3. K-Knight Assassins don't really matter all that much. You have good lore choices, good hero choices, a good arming roster as well. Because be it Dread Spears from the main settlement buildings, Dark Shards, Bleak Swords, Dark Shards with shields, or moving on to Black Ark Corsairs, all of the early game Dark Elven units are fairly solid. The best one is, of course, the Black Ark Corsairs, which you can recruit much earlier than tier 3 by getting a Black Ark, which simply requires you to get the Slave Pens building. Once you get that and you have a port, you can get the Black Ark, and the Black Ark can allow you to recruit Black Ark Corsairs at tier 1 and gives you other advantages. Black Arks are your replacement for not having global recruitment as the Dark Elf. So there's a lot of things that make this campaign work. It's a fairly safe campaign position because you start with the province, basically. That's not that difficult to defend because there's only so many ways to attack it, and especially if you have good relations with Mazdamundi, you're certainly never going to be in any trouble in this campaign in terms of like losing your territory, and you have a lot of potential in this campaign as well. But also some lessons that you need to learn along the way. At number 4, we have Isabella von Karstein or Vlad von Karstein. They're both starting in the same position. The faction leader is going to be Vlad regardless. The difference is that Isabella is the legendary lord in this case, or whereas if you pick Vlad, he's the legendary lord, and Isabella is the legendary hero in this particular campaign. Isabella just has better faction benefits if you choose to play as her. Now, the vampire counts are great for a number of reasons. They have really powerful lords, so you don't really risk losing them battle, unless you're talking about the necromancer lords over here, the master necromancer lords over here. But otherwise, their heroes and lords are pretty good, pretty strong, pretty capable to give you a good variety of effects. And also, crucially, you do have a good economy as the vampire counts. You won't have to deal with the issues of control because of the vampire corruptions, though you do have downsides if you move in territory that doesn't have vampire corruption. But corruption isn't really an issue in Warhammer 3 the way it was in some previous games. So corruption is very easy to spread once you capture territories. I think it was a great change on Creative Assembly's decision, the way they decided to change corruption as opposed to slow growth and slow decay that we used to have, or far slower growth and decay anyway. But what I also think is great about the vampire counts is they have a lot of power, but they do have downsides as well. And you don't just want to throw a race stat that's like, oh, I'm going to smash everything in my path with no opposition. That's not quite how things are going to work out for the vampire counts. Their auto-resolve situation is not necessarily the best in the world, and a lot of factions do hate them. So you do need to engage in the diplomatic game if you're going to be able to succeed as the vampire counts, especially in this kind of start position. If you want an easier campaign, play Helman Gorst. He has quite a bit more power in a much safer position. But all the same, I think this campaign is great for a learning tool, because you do have to engage in diplomacy to be successful here, trading of settlements, making alliances, and you can make it with the Empire, you can make it with the Dwarves, or with other factions if you so decide. What's also great about the Vampire Counts is because of their Raise Dead mechanic, which replaces their global recruitment, you can actually get access to basically the entire Vampire Counts roster much faster than many other factions. Unless we're talking about Warriors Cast for the upgrade system, of course. This is fantastic because it really lets you play around with different units, figuring out what's good and what isn't. Graveguard in general are the best unit you want to mass. Though, to be honest, you also want to have the cheap zombies and skeletal warriors to be able to afford more armies. Like, it can be a great tool for people to figure out that just making an ultra powerful army filled with tier 4 and tier 5 units isn't necessarily the best decision they can make in the world. So, yes, there are some lessons to be learned from playing this campaign, some harsh lessons. You can get a bit carried away over here by the power you can get from recruitment, but it's great just having that kind of versatility in recruitment, making those kind of varied armies, which I think is a problem in the case of a lot of races, because you do need a lot of different buildings to recruit a lot of different units. You still do as the Vampire Counts, though you can always use the Raise Dead, and just have variety in your armies, play around with things, see what you enjoy playing with, see what works for you when it comes to army rosters, hero rosters, lord rosters as well. You also have a large selection of lord choices that are all pretty good. These bloodline lords, not quite legendary lords, but certainly better than the default lords. So a good amount of versatility as well in this campaign when it comes to army choices, when it comes to lord choices, hero choices. Good amount of power, good amount of variety in the way you can play the campaign. Though also not a free ride either, because to the north you do have the major gargantuan threat of Draika, and while she's certainly not in her final form on normal difficulty, she still can hold her own against the best of them, and of course Azag the Slaughterer there as well. Things can go really badly in this campaign, but you know what? Giving people a free ride, they're not going to learn anything from that. And I think that is an important factor to consider. I would actually rate this campaign a bit higher, to be honest, but Dodge Resolve just drags it down for me. The Vampire Counts do have a significant problem in terms of that. I mean, their army will win every battle you fight manually without too much difficulty, even if you fill it with chaff, because your lords and heroes can do all the heavy lifting on their own. The army is kind of secondary in a lot of situations to that. Also, lacking siege can present certain issues when you're dealing with siege battles, just not being able to break the walls, not being able to deal with the wall towers, can certainly present some difficulties, but you have all the tools available to be able to deal with the problems you have. Just difficulties as well when you're dealing with this particular race and this particular campaign. At number 3, we have Grombrindal, the White Dwarf of the Dwarven race. Now, I wouldn't recommend the Dwarves in a lot of ways, but Grombrindal certainly goes a long way towards fixing some of their issues, though certainly not all of them. They're still going to have piss poor growth, and they're still going to have limits early on because of their economy, though obviously playing on lower difficulties doesn't create the same kind of issues on higher difficulties. You just start with more money, you have a more leisurely time when it comes down to it. You do have a pretty powerful army, and you do have a runesmith hero as well that you can attach to this army very quickly, so you do have the runes that can do a lot of damage. The Rune of Wrath from Ruin is the one you want to go for. Grombrindal is pretty strong, and he also has the ability of getting a barracks to tier 2 very quickly, and also getting artillery pretty quickly in his campaign as well, because he just builds the siege workshop and he gets access to grudge throwers. You just get like 2 free, I'd say free grudge throwers, and then you get rid of this building. You don't necessarily get free grudge throwers in Grombrindal's army. You get 2 for his army and 1 for your secondary army, and then get rid of it because you'll get a regiment renowned for the 4th if you have the DLC, of course. Or you get the 4th one if you don't have the DLC. But you do have a good amount of power in this campaign. You do have a pretty easy enemy to deal with, especially on lower difficulties, because the Skaven don't amount to much on lower difficulties, especially these minor Skaven factions. And this faction is also a War of Malekith, so between you and Malekith, you're going to wipe these guys out very, very quickly during the course of the campaign. It's also a pretty straightforward campaign. Unlike the vampire accounts may not necessarily have a straightforward campaign. Things can go wrong, very wrong in that. Whereas Grombrindal's campaign is pretty straightforward for a large portion of it. Smash the Skaven, take the Altar of Ultimate Darkness, go here, smash some more Skaven, take this province, or at least this particular capital, give it to the ogres, and then go kill Malekith. And you'll be able to easily deal with it. A crucial point I would give for anyone starting a campaign in Warhammer 3 is you want to be aggressive in a campaign, because that's how you achieve the most in a campaign, being aggressive. Playing passively doesn't really work out for any race, for any legendary lord. So be aggressive, conquer territory very quickly, don't be concerned about casualties. But this is a thing that's great about Grombrindal. Through his Living Ancestor event, he can get ridiculous levels of casualty replenishment from the very start of his campaign. So he can actually take a lot of damage and recover from that damage easily, which means you can make mistakes in battles. You can choose battles that you wouldn't normally choose and out-resolve them even, or even if you're fighting them manually and you're taking significant casualties, you can recover from them. So pretty straightforward campaign when it comes to grudges, just smash the elves. The Dark Elves, then poor Lefanar over here who's going to get bullied by you and other factions. Or you can choose to reserve your ire for some other High Elf. But pretty straightforward campaign, pretty good amount of power. He is the most powerful legendary lord of the Dwarves by far when we're talking about his faction-wide effects. Forik does have a much better army, but Grombrindal has much better faction effects. And the thing, what's also great about Grombrindal is you can't really go wrong with the skills you're picking up. Blue line, red line. Melee line is actually the one that's worth the least, but special skill line, blue line, red line, you get benefits. Always go for attack, tradition, and innovation. Get quarrelers very quickly in your campaign and just spam quarrelers in your campaign. Or on lower difficulties, you can just make it work with dwarf warriors and miners or blasting charges. It does work. They're cheaper, by the way. The only major issue you may encounter in the campaign is, of course, Valkia, but on lower difficulties, she's far less formidable than on higher difficulties. She's actually going to take quite a few turns on normal to actually take this particular settlement and then take Agron. So by the time you encounter her, you probably have gained a decent level of power and you should be able to wipe her out. And then it's pretty straightforward. Tarax might ruin your party, but he doesn't necessarily amount to much either. And you're in a pretty nice pocket of the campaign map. The Greenskins might pose a problem, but generally they leave you alone because Katep is at war with them, and Katep will wipe them out, and Katep doesn't hate you. He doesn't really care for you in any way, shape, or form, one way or another. So you've got a fairly safe campaign situation with a lot of potential as well during the course of it. So deal with some grudges, then take this naval route and go into Cafe and enjoy the wonders of Cafe. Not necessarily playing as Cafe, but playing as the White Dwarf for your wondrous journey to get back to the Dwarven lands. That probably is the best campaign plan if you're playing Grombrindal. Or just cross the seas, go into Albion, smash Bellicor, and make your way from Bretonnia and the Empire very quickly to reach the Dwarven lands. Because you do have a ridiculous level of campaign movement range. 15% from your blue line, 15 extra percent through Grombrindal's special skill line. Lots of movement range, which is actually a significant amount of power in a campaign, and is important when you're trying to figure out what you're doing in a campaign. Campaign movement range has always been a significant amount of power. Pretty straightforward campaign in a lot of ways. The Dwarves are a fairly blunt and straightforward race in a lot of ways as well, at least early on in their campaigns. Later on, obviously, they do have some significant issues, but yeah, Grombrindal is a good lord. He does have good skills. He does have a lot of campaign potential. Now in number 2, we have Grimgor Ironhide. Also a fairly straightforward campaign in a lot of ways, like other campaigns have been on this list, though that may not last for much longer once they add the Cast Dwarves in, well, basically this entire area of the campaign map. We'll see how that changes things for Grimgor, but for a moment, he's pretty straightforward. You head east, you conquer the Greenskins you start at war with, then you may or may not deal with Kolic. You don't necessarily have to deal with Kolic. It can be a major fight, but you certainly have all the tools available to be able to win it. If you want a bit of a challenge, yeah, go deal with him quickly enough, but you can do so pretty quickly and then conquer the entirety of the Mountains of Morn and gain a significant economy, a lot of money. The Greenskins thrive on aggression, they thrive on conflict, they thrive on battles, they gain a lot of money from that. The Greenskins aren't a race that just sits home and enjoys their pretty decent economy, actually. No, they want to conquer. They gain a lot of money from taking settlements, post-battle loot, sacking settlements. So that's how you want to play as the Greenskins. So this is the kind of race that will reward aggression, but of course they have downsides. They're not necessarily the best when it comes to the auto-resolve situation. Their regular lore choices can be fairly mediocre. And actually the Goblin Grey Shaman is actually the best one because of the Goblin Tide. And they do benefit a lot from getting a lot of Goblin units early on, and the Orcs later on. For Grimgor, especially with the Black Orcs. Start your campaign getting a bunch of Goblin Archers. You gain extra local recruitment capacity with each settlement that you take, which is actually pretty significant because quite a lot of races only have the local recruitment capacity of 2. You start with 3, you can get a lot more during the course of a Greenskin campaign. So a good amount of power, a good amount of flexibility in your roster, good hero choices that you can get access to fairly quickly actually in your campaign at tier 3, even tier 2 with Boss's Tent with the Goblin Big Boss, or at least only one of them, because in order to increase capacity for them, you do need to get to tier 4, which is a bit of a shame. But then again, these guys are not necessarily what you really care when it comes to hero choices. Grimgor does have a Black Orc Big Boss. He gets faction-wide benefits when it comes to recruiting them, campaign movement range. So yeah, great starting position, fairly easy starting position, actually, in a lot of ways, because there's no other faction to oppose you except Kolic. Gonna change with the Dwarves, of course, but still, pretty straightforward campaign. Good amount of power, pretty decent starting army, versatile roster for the race, good hero choices, good unit selection, plenty of things to like when it comes to the Greenskins, without descending in the farce that the Warriors of Chaos can. Like, I wanted to include Be'lakor on this list, there's reasons to do so, flexible campaign and all that, but at the same time, Warriors of Chaos are just too ridiculous at the moment. I'm not sure how you could even nerf them without completely breaking their race either. That's the unfortunate part at the moment. We'll see what comes up. Hell, who knows, maybe the Dwarves will be a race to add on this list, though given their racial mechanics, probably not, actually. Still, Grimgor, pretty straightforward campaign when it comes down to it. It's hard to fail it. You have a really powerful duelist, powerful units from the very start, good economy, and a straightforward path that's easy enough to understand. And finally, at number 1, it is of course Tyrion of the High Elves, the only campaign Creative Assembly got right in their list. This is a great campaign for people to learn to play the game because you have a fairly versatile roster with the High Elves, good hero choices, good lore choices. Well, 2 of them are really good, one of them is mediocre at best. And a fairly straightforward campaign with a lot of power. Tyrion is a great duelist in the game, he has good items, he has pretty decent quest battles that aren't the most excruciatingly painful in the world, but they're also not just the complete the biggest cakewalk in the world either. So pretty straightforward campaign, has a lot of diplomatic possibilities over here, and you do need to engage in diplomacy if you're playing the Elves in order to succeed, because their economy depends on trade. Without trade, you've got really not much going for you if you're playing the Elves, so you do need that. This is actually one of the issues that does doom Imric and to a certain degree Teclis. Those are some of the issues that they do encounter in their campaigns, at least initially. They do resolve them later on. Another great thing about the High Elves for a beginner campaign is that your basic units, your spearmen and light and archers that you can recruit from any settlement, are actually some of the best units in your roster. You can play an entire campaign or entire campaigns with the High Elves just playing with spearmen and archers, though I personally prefer to get archers with light armor from the tier 1 barracks, but still, it's a tier 1 barracks, very easy to get access to it. Fairly straightforward campaign, you take out the Cult of Excess, you capture an entire province, bam, you have a province of 4 regions, great deal of power. Then you might want to deal with Calador, with Noctilus, and with Terranok. Or, what I prefer to do, because I don't want Alariel to do it, she will, by the way, if you let her, I take Safri, get a province with 3 regions, fairly secure, fairly safe. Ulthuan is in the middle of the ocean. Now, if you control all of Ulthuan, it can be a bit exposed from all the factions that surround it to the west, to the north, and all that. But when you're dealing with Tyrion, you're only dealing with the southern part of Ulthuan, which is also the safest part of Ulthuan. There are certainly some downsides in this campaign, like High Elves can only get artillery at tier 3 with the structure that you just get for that one unit, because the other units aren't really important in your campaign. And they do certainly have some issues to overcome, like increasing hero capacity requires you to get tier 4 structures, be it with Handmaidens at tier 4 from Blessed Grove, if you have the DLC, the Alariel's DLC, the Grand Repository for Lore Masters and Mages to increase their capacity, or with Nobles at tier 4 from the Elven Court. Also, research is locked off behind certain structures that you would not necessarily build all the time. Like the Elven Embassy, yes, you would build, but having to build an Elven Court can feel a bit annoying. It's not just an Elven Court, it's also the Shrine of Assyrian, which is not the structure you wouldn't necessarily bother with, certainly not at tier 3 where you can get it. Like at tier 4 or tier 5, sure, but not at tier 3. So it can be a bit annoying when it comes to some of those limitations. Those limitations don't really impact the power of the High Elves, but it's certainly a level of frustration when it comes down to it. But fairly simple campaign, straightforward campaign, lots of diplomatic options, lots of expansion options, actually. When it comes down to it, like you can go over here, or you can conquer the rest of Ulthuan if you so desire, or conquer Nagrand. When it comes to it, you can't go east because of the climate, though some of the climate isn't necessarily too bad. You certainly have the economy to deal with the unpleasant situation. One major downside in this campaign, from what I've been told, is you can't actually confederate Alariel or Alfarian, who starts over here in the east. You can't confederate them if you don't own their DLCs, from what I've been told. I don't know this for certain. Obviously, I've owned their DLC for a fair amount of time, so I can't really test this on my own. Feel free to let me know how that situation is. But even if that's the case, it's not really too much of a problem, because you can certainly win the campaign even without getting Alariel or Alfarian. You just need to get it to make sure that you're allied with them and you control the entirety of Ulthuan. Then you go on an epic world journey to eliminate all the Dark Elven factions, which includes coming over here to deal with Rakarth, and then going with to Cafe Fruad with the sea lane that's near Rakarth, to get to Lockyer, assuming the Caphayans and Lizardmen don't wipe them out first when it comes down to it. But still, good amount of power. What's also great is that Tyrion does get recruitment time duration for infantry units of -1, construction time for the Shrine of Cain. Diplomatic relations will really help you out with the diplomacy. And then this particular skill line, not the Bloodline of Anarion, this buffs his combat power, but we really want to go with the Majesty of Ulthuan for recruitment cost benefits, income from all buildings and local province, more diplomatic relations, and upkeep 10% to all armies. Pretty significant when it comes down to it. Anyway, that's all there is to say. Costine here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. If you have some campaigns you'd put on this list, please leave a comment below. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this subject. Stay tuned for more.